The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl whisper, "He hid me here," at the gas station, and his fury lit the desert. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The wind howled across the empty desert highway, carrying with it the harsh scent of dry earth and dust. Under the dim lights of a gas station, the silence was broken only by the low rumble of a motorcycle's engine. Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels biker, pulled his Harley-Davidson to a stop at the pump. He was a seasoned rider, having roamed the open roads for years, the weight of his leather jacket and his patches signaling authority. But tonight, something was different. As he dismounted and approached the pump, he heard it. A faint voice, weak, barely a whisper, carried through the cold air. "He hid me here." His instincts kicked in. He turned, scanning the gas station for the source of the voice. There, hidden in the shadows, was a young girl, no more than 10 or 11, with dirt on her face and fear in her eyes. She looked fragile, her small body shivering in the night air. The biker's heart hardened. He had seen too many troubled souls, but something about this girl, it stirred something deep inside him. His hands clenched into fists, and the anger that had been dormant for so long flared to life. The fury in his chest was fueled by the desperation in her voice. Who had done this to her? What had she seen? His mind raced as he approached her cautiously, not wanting to startle her. The girl recoiled, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt me." Reaper knelt down, his voice soft despite the storm inside him. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." She didn't speak, but her fearful gaze never left him. There was a moment of silence as Reaper scanned the area, looking for any sign of who might be after her. The gas station was deserted, the night air still, but the tension in the air was palpable. He could feel it in his bones. Someone was out there. Someone dangerous. He extended his hand to the girl, trying to convey that he was no threat. Slowly, she took it, her small fingers trembling in his grip. He helped her to her feet, and as she stood, she clung to him, her body weak and trembling from both fear and exhaustion. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. They're looking for me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Reaper's mind raced. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Whoever was after her was close. The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. "He hid me here," she repeated. The words sank deep into his chest. It was clear that she had been running from something or someone dangerous. The fury inside him boiled over. Reaper stood up, pulling the girl closer as he scanned the dark horizon. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt her, not while he was around. He pulled his jacket tighter around her, trying to shield her from the cold. "We're leaving here," he said, his voice firm. He wasn't sure who was after her, but he knew one thing for certain. No one was going to hurt this girl while he still drew breath. He led her to his bike, revving the engine and speeding off into the night, the headlights cutting through the desert darkness. But in the back of his mind, one question gnawed at him. Who was hiding this girl, and why? Reaper rode through the desert night, the roar of his Harley-Davidson cutting through the stillness. The girl, still clinging to him, sat behind him, wrapped in his leather jacket. Her small hands tightened around his waist, her body trembling against his as they sped through the darkness. The cold air whipped around them, but it wasn't just the chill of the night that made her shiver. Reaper could feel it too, the weight of something dark hanging over them. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, her voice barely audible as she spoke again. "I don't want to go back. Please, don't make me go back." Reaper glanced over his shoulder, his grip tightening on the handlebars. "You're safe now. I'm not letting anyone hurt you." The bike hummed steadily beneath them as they drove, the engine's growl matching the pounding of his heart. He could feel his anger bubbling up again. Who were these people chasing her? What had they done to her? It didn't matter. He'd make sure no one hurt this girl, not while he was still breathing. They reached the edge of a small town, the lights glowing faintly in the distance. Reaper slowed the bike, his eyes scanning the area. It was too quiet, too still. He could feel the presence of someone watching, lurking in the shadows. As they approached the edge of town, the girl leaned closer, her voice trembling. He told me not to trust anyone. Reaper's pulse quickened. Who? Who told you that? But she didn't answer. Instead, she buried her face into his back, her small body shaking as if she were trying to hide from something only she could see. Reaper's eyes narrowed. Whoever was after her had to be close. He could sense it. He pulled the bike to a stop near a dark alleyway, his instincts kicking into high gear. Stay here, he said, his voice low. He swung off the bike, scanning the area. There was a nearby diner, its neon lights flickering weakly in the cold desert air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Reaper knew trouble when he smelled it. As he moved toward the diner, he saw a man standing by the door. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket with a logo Reaper didn't recognize. The man's eyes locked onto him, and for a brief moment, Reaper felt his heart rate spike. He was too far to make a move, but the guy was definitely watching. Reaper stepped inside the diner, his boots making a solid thud on the wooden floor. The bell above the door jingled, and the waitress behind the counter gave him a wary look before quickly turning her attention back to the cup of coffee she was pouring. Reaper glanced around, trying to read the room. It was a small place, only a few patrons scattered around. Most of them were huddled together in groups, keeping to themselves. But there was a tension in the air, a weight that pressed down on his chest. He could feel it. Someone was waiting. I need a place to stay for the night, Reaper said, his voice calm, but it carried the weight of a man used to being feared. The waitress nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. Sure, we've got a small motel a few blocks down. You can rest there, but you'll have to leave by morning. Reaper's eyes flicked to the window, where the man from outside was now standing across the street. The man was staring directly at him. Reaper's gut told him something wasn't right. Is there a back exit here? He asked, his voice steady. The waitress gave him a confused look. Oh yeah? Out back, but it's just the alley. What? Because someone's following me? Reaper said. The waitress's face went pale. You're serious? Reaper didn't answer. He just walked back to the door, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. He pushed the door open, the cold night air biting at his face. The man was still there, standing in the shadows, watching. Reaper's eyes narrowed. He wasn't about to let this man follow him or the girl. With a swift motion, Reaper pulled his leather jacket tighter around his body, his fingers brushing the cold steel of the gun hidden at his waist. He was ready. The man across the street took a step forward, his hand sliding into his jacket. Reaper moved quickly, crossing the street and stepping into the shadows. The man didn't see him coming. A few seconds later, he was face to face with Reaper, his eyes wide with surprise. You were looking for trouble, weren't you? Reaper growled, his hand clenched around the man's collar. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting around for an escape. I don't know what you're talking about, the man stammered. Reaper's grip tightened. You're lying. Who sent you after the girl? The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached for a knife hidden in his jacket. Reaper reacted instinctively, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a single swift blow. The man dropped to the ground, unconscious. Reaper stood over him, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He looked around, his eyes scanning for any more threats. But there was nothing. It was just him and the girl now. Reaper's mind raced as he walked back to the bike. Whoever was after her wasn't done. He had to figure out who these people were before it was too late. Reaper revved the engine of his Harley-Davidson, the roar of the bike echoing through the desolate desert night. The girl sat behind him, clutching him tightly, her small hands cold against his back. As they raced down the empty highway, the weight of their situation hung heavy in the air. Reaper could feel the tension building. Whoever was after her wasn't going to stop. He could sense it in his gut. They had already made one move, but he knew this wasn't over. He pushed the bike faster, the dark road stretching out before him, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. He needed to get them to safety. They couldn't stay on the move forever. As the miles passed, the girl remained silent, her face buried in his back. Reaper could feel her trembling, and he knew it wasn't just from the cold. The fear was still there, pressing down on her. She had been through something terrible, and he couldn't let her go back to it. He glanced over his shoulder, the lights of a distant town appearing on the horizon. He didn't know where he was headed, but he knew it had to be far enough from whoever was after her. They needed a place to lay low, at least for a little while. He slowed as they approached the small town, looking for a place to rest. His eyes landed on a motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. He pulled into the parking lot, the bike's engine dying as they came to a stop. The girl slid off the bike, her legs unsteady as she took a step forward. Reaper was already at her side, his hand steady on her arm as he guided her inside. The motel's office was small and dimly lit. The owner, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, looked up from behind the counter as they entered. "You two need a room?" he asked, his voice rough. Reaper nodded, his eyes scanning the small space. "Yeah, just for the night." The man nodded and handed him a key. "Room 4, down the hall." Reaper took the key, not bothering to ask for anything else. He led the girl down the hall, the weight of the situation pressing on him. They reached the room, and he opened the door, ushering her inside. He locked the door behind them, then turned to her. "Sit down," he said, his voice soft but firm. The girl nodded and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wringing together in her lap. Reaper watched her for a moment, the silence between them heavy. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I don't know who they are. They came for me. I ran." Reaper's heart clenched. "Where did you run from?" The girl hesitated, her eyes darting away. "I was at a foster home. It wasn't safe. But I ran because he said he'd find me." She shuddered, her hands shaking. "Who said that?" Reaper pressed. The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "My father." Reaper's brows furrowed. "Your father?" "He wasn't my real father. He was the man who took me in when my real father—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. Reaper knelt down in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of trust and doubt. She had been through too much, and Reaper could feel the weight of it. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble they were in, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her go back. Not to him, not to anyone. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reaper stood, his jaw clenched. "We keep moving. You're not going back to that place." He walked to the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot. He could feel the eyes on him, even from here. Whoever had sent that man was still out there, waiting. But Reaper wasn't about to wait for them to make their next move. He would find them first. He would make sure they didn't hurt her. He turned back to the girl, his expression hardening. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice full of determination. She nodded, her hands still trembling. "Where will we go?" Reaper paused, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing. "We'll figure it out," he said. "But you're safe now. And that's all that matters." As they packed up, the weight of the situation still hung over them. Reaper couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The man he had knocked out earlier had to be connected to something bigger. Someone was after her, and Reaper wouldn't stop until he found out who. He grabbed the keys and motioned for the girl to follow him. As they stepped out of the motel room, the cold night air hit them again. But this time, it wasn't just the chill of the desert. It was the cold weight of the danger still lingering just beyond the horizon. But Reaper was ready. He would protect this girl, no matter what it took. Reaper's eyes scanned the parking lot as the girl followed him out of the motel room. The cold desert air cut through his leather jacket, but it was the weight of the situation that had his mind racing. The night had been too quiet. He could feel the presence of someone watching, waiting. Whoever was after the girl hadn't given up, and Reaper wasn't about to let them catch up. He wasn't sure how far ahead they were, but he knew he had to keep moving. He started the bike, its engine roaring to life, the sound breaking the silence of the night. The girl hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the back of the Harley, her small hands gripping him tightly. Reaper could feel the tension in her, the fear still hanging in the air. "You're safe now," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She didn't reply, but he felt her nod against his back as they sped into the night. As they drove through the dark desert, the landscape blurred by the headlights, Reaper couldn't help but think about what she had told him. Her father, the man who had taken her in. There was something about the way she said it, the way she trembled at the mention of him, that made Reaper's blood run cold. He had to know more. Who was he? Why was he chasing his own daughter? They had been on the road for hours, heading towards a small town on the outskirts of the desert when Reaper saw the sign for a diner. It was a rundown place, with flickering neon lights and a small parking lot filled with old cars. He slowed the bike, pulling into the lot. We need to stop, Reaper said, turning to look at the girl. She looked at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Are you sure? She asked, her voice small. Reaper nodded, his expression hardening. I'm sure. We need to rest. It's better to be safe here than keep running. The girl didn't argue. She simply followed him as they walked into the diner. The smell of coffee and greasy food filled the air as they stepped inside. It was quiet, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. A few people sat at the counter, none of them paying much attention to the two newcomers. Reaper walked up to the counter, the waitress behind it looking up at him with wary eyes. What can I get you? She asked, her voice flat. Reaper glanced at the girl, then back at the waitress. Just a coffee, he said. And a room for the night, if you've got one. The waitress nodded, writing down his order. We've got a room in the back. It's not much, but it's safe. Reaper paid for the room, then turned to the girl. You'll be okay here for a while, he said. I'm going to keep watch outside. I don't trust this place. The girl nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Reaper left the diner and stood outside, his back against the wall. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His gut was telling him that whoever was after the girl was getting closer. He scanned the parking lot, looking for any sign of movement. It wasn't long before he saw it. A dark car, parked a few spaces down, with two men inside. They were watching him. Reaper's grip tightened around the handle of his bike. He couldn't let them get any closer. The girl was already traumatized, and he wasn't about to let them hurt her again. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He was going to have to confront them. He couldn't let them keep following him. The tension in the air was thick, and Reaper's mind raced. Who were these men? Were they working with the girl's father, or were they just hired guns? He couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. He turned and walked back inside the diner, his eyes locked on the men in the car. As he approached, the waitress caught his eye. Everything okay? She asked, her tone cautious. Reaper nodded, his eyes still focused on the men outside. Yeah, just need to make a call. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Get ready, he muttered into the phone. We've got company. The phone clicked as he hung up. He turned back to the girl, who was sitting quietly at the counter, her eyes fixed on her coffee. Stay close, he said. And don't trust anyone here. I don't know who's watching us, but I've got a feeling it's not over. The girl nodded, her face pale. Reaper stepped outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes on him, but he wasn't afraid. Whoever these men were, they wouldn't get away with it. He had a job to do, and he was going to protect the girl, no matter what it took. Reaper stood outside the diner, his eyes locked on the car across the parking lot. The two men in the vehicle hadn't moved since he'd last seen them. He could feel the weight of their gaze, even from this distance. They were waiting for him to make a move, and he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The girl was inside, safe for now, but he knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. His fingers brushed the cool metal of the gun at his side, the weight of it grounding him. He was ready. He had to be. His mind raced as he tried to figure out who these men were and why they were after the girl. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and Reaper wasn't sure how much longer they could stay ahead of whoever was hunting them. He glanced around the quiet town, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. The air felt thick with tension. Reaper turned his attention back to the men in the car. They hadn't made a move yet, but he could tell they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, quickly checking the screen. It was a text message from his old friend, Steele. Got eyes on them. They've been tracking you since you left the last town. Don't trust anyone. Reaper's jaw tightened as he read the message. He had a bad feeling about this. Whoever was after them had been watching their every move. He sent a quick reply. Stay close. I'll handle it. With a deep breath, Reaper pushed the door open and walked back into the diner. The girl was still sitting at the counter, her eyes glued to her coffee. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could feel the quiet anxiety radiating off of her. He walked over and sat beside her, his presence a silent reassurance. We need to get moving, he said, his voice steady but low. She looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. I don't want to go back to him, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Reaper felt a pang in his chest, but he kept his expression hard. You're not going back. Not ever. The words were as much for himself as they were for her. He couldn't let her go back to whatever nightmare she had escaped from. The girl nodded, her small hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her cup. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Reaper looked toward the window, his mind running through options. There was no time to waste. The men in the car weren't going to wait much longer. He needed to get her to safety. "We'll head out to the old cabin up north," Reaper said, his tone final. It was a place he'd kept hidden for years, a place far enough off the grid that no one would think to look. He stood up, offering her his hand. "We'll be safe there. Come on." She hesitated for a moment, then took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Together, they left the diner and walked toward the bike. Reaper's eyes never left the car. The men were still there, watching, but now they were making their move. As soon as Reaper started the bike, the car's engine roared to life, and the men pulled out of the parking lot, following them. Reaper's heart pounded in his chest as he revved the engine, pulling the girl onto the back of the Harley. "Hold on," he said, his voice grim. The bike tore down the road, the wind rushing past them. He could feel the men behind them, getting closer. He pushed the bike harder, weaving through the streets, trying to lose them in the winding roads. The girl clung to him, her face pressed against his back, her breathing shallow with fear. Reaper's mind raced as he turned a corner and saw the road ahead stretch into the dark, empty desert. He had to get them off this path. He had to shake these men before they made their move. Without warning, he slammed on the brakes, sending the bike skidding to a halt. The men in the car weren't expecting it. Reaper quickly turned the bike around, his eyes narrowing as he revved the engine and sped in the opposite direction. The car followed, its headlights a glaring beacon in the distance. Reaper's hands tightened around the handlebars, the girl's arms wrapped tightly around his waist. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had to make this work. He knew this desert like the back of his hand, and he was going to use that to his advantage. They raced down a narrow dirt road, the sound of the car's tires slipping on the gravel echoing in the night. Reaper's mind was focused, calculating the next move. He knew the terrain better than anyone, and he was going to use that to lose the men chasing them. He spotted a hill in the distance, a steep incline that would be difficult for the car to navigate. Without hesitation, he swerved the bike toward it, speeding up. The girl gasped as they hit the hill, the bike bouncing over the uneven ground. Reaper gritted his teeth, feeling the strain on the tires as they climbed the slope. Behind them, the car struggled to keep up. He could hear the engine revving, but it was too slow. The car couldn't handle the rough terrain. Reaper pushed the bike harder, the top of the hill in sight. The men in the car were falling behind. For the first time since they had started this chase, Reaper felt a flicker of hope. They might just make it out of this. Reaper's heart pounded in his chest as he sped up the incline, the bike's tires skidding slightly over the loose gravel. The wind howled around them, and the girl clung to him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Her breath was shaky against his back, but she held on, determined not to let go. In the distance, he could hear the growl of the car's engine as it struggled to keep pace, but Reaper wasn't worried. The hill would take care of that. As they reached the top, Reaper's eyes scanned the horizon. The terrain ahead was open and treacherous, a patchwork of rocks and loose sand, but it was the perfect place to lose the men chasing them. He slammed the throttle down, sending the bike soaring over the top of the hill. The rear wheel kicked up a cloud of dust, and they were off again, racing down the other side. The car behind them couldn't keep up. It was too heavy, too slow for this kind of terrain. Reaper glanced back once, catching a glimpse of the headlights behind them before they vanished from view. He pushed the bike harder, the roar of the engine filling his ears as they raced through the dark. The road ahead was a blur, but Reaper knew exactly where he was going. He had a few old trails out here in the desert, secret paths that no one else knew about. They would take him to a place where the men following him would never think to look. The girl's hands tightened around him as they hit another bump, but she didn't scream. She was quiet now, her breathing steady. Reaper knew she was scared, but he also knew that she trusted him. And that trust was all that mattered right now. He had to get them both to safety. They hit another curve, and Reaper steered the bike to the left, sending them into a narrow path between two rocky outcroppings. The bike bounced over the uneven ground, but Reaper kept control, his eyes locked on the path ahead. He could feel the girl's body press against him with each jolt, but she held on, her grip unwavering. As they navigated through the tight passage, the sounds of the chase began to fade. The car was far behind now, and Reaper allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They were getting closer to the hidden cabin, a place he'd kept secret for years. It was a place no one would think to look, a place he could hide out with the girl until the threat passed. He felt a slight shift in the girl's posture behind him, and then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are we going?" Reaper didn't hesitate. "A safe place," he replied. "It's a cabin up ahead. No one knows about it." The girl didn't ask any more questions. She just held on, her breath slowing as she seemed to relax, if only a little. Reaper knew it wasn't over, but for now, they had a moment of peace. They reached the edge of the narrow trail, and Reaper slowed the bike to a crawl as they entered a clearing. In the distance, through the sparse trees and brush, he could see the cabin. It was small and worn, but it was home. As they pulled up to the front of the cabin, Reaper killed the engine, the quiet settling in around them. He looked at the girl. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice firm. "I'll check the place out first." The girl nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. Reaper walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching softly on the ground. He pushed the door open cautiously, scanning the room. It was empty, just as he'd left it. He had stocked up on supplies the last time he had come here, so they wouldn't have to worry about food or water. The only thing left was to make sure they weren't being followed. Reaper stepped inside and checked every corner, every window, making sure the cabin was secure. Satisfied, he stepped back outside and nodded at the girl. "It's safe," he said. The girl climbed off the bike and followed him inside, her steps slow but steady. Reaper closed the door behind her, locking it with a firm click. The inside of the cabin was small but cozy. There was a small couch against one wall, a rickety wooden table in the center of the room, and a small kitchen off to the side. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. He led the girl to the couch, helping her sit down. She looked around, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. Reaper sat across from her, leaning back against the wall. "We'll rest here for the night," he said, his voice calm. "We'll figure out what to do next." "In the morning." The girl nodded, her eyes tired but still alert. She looked at him for a long moment, her lips trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but sincere. Reaper gave her a small nod. "No need to thank me," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." For the first time since he had met her, the girl seemed to relax. She leaned back against the couch, her eyes closing as she let out a long breath. Reaper stayed awake for a while, his mind still racing. He knew this was only the beginning. The men after her wouldn't stop, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. But for now, the girl was safe. And that's all that mattered. The first light of morning filtered through the small window of the cabin, casting long shadows across the room. Reaper sat in the same chair he had last night, his eyes locked on the door. The girl had fallen asleep on the couch, her small form curled up under an old blanket he had found. She was quiet now, but Reaper could feel the weight of the silence. He knew that nothing good could come from this. Whoever was after her, whoever had done this, wasn't going to stop. The bike had been hidden in the back of the cabin, a place no one would think to look. But that didn't mean they wouldn't keep looking. The girl's past, her father, the men chasing them, it all had to tie together somehow, and Reaper was determined to find out how. His thoughts were interrupted when the girl stirred. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the sunlight. Her gaze settled on him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, but also something else. Trust. She was starting to trust him, and that was something he wasn't used to. "Morning," Reaper said softly, his voice gruff. She nodded, sitting up slowly, her legs stiff from sleeping on the couch. She looked around the small room, her expression unreadable. "How long have we been here?" she asked quietly. "Since last night," Reaper replied. "You slept for a few hours. We're safe for now, but we can't stay here for long." The girl nodded again, her eyes distant. "I don't want to go back to him," she said, her voice trembling. Reaper's heart tightened. He had seen enough to know that whatever had happened to her, whatever her father had done, was more than she was ready to talk about. He didn't push. He just nodded. "You're not going back," he said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of that." The girl's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of hope in them. Reaper stood up, his boots scraping softly on the wooden floor. "I'm going to check outside. Stay here, stay quiet." The girl didn't argue. She simply nodded, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders as Reaper stepped outside. The desert was still, the only sound the wind whispering through the dry brush. Reaper's eyes scanned the horizon, the vast emptiness stretching out before him. There was no sign of anyone, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. The men from the car had to be close, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. He walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, ensuring there were no signs of anyone having followed them. The ground was undisturbed, the bushes around the cabin untouched. He felt a slight relief, but knew it wouldn't last long. The girl was still a target, and as long as she was with him, so was he. He returned to the cabin and found her sitting on the couch, her face pale but calm. "Everything looks clear," he said, his eyes lingering on her for a moment. "We're going to leave soon. I'll take you somewhere safe." The girl nodded, her eyes still wide but full of something else now, determination. She didn't speak, but the change in her was clear. She was ready to leave her past behind, ready to move forward, even if it meant facing the unknown. Reaper grabbed his gear, checking his weapons one last time. He knew that they couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, and fast. The girl's father, whoever he was, wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. "Stay close," Reaper said, pulling the bike out from behind the cabin. The girl climbed onto the back, her hands gripping him once again, but this time with more certainty. Reaper started the bike and headed down the dirt road, the cabin disappearing in the distance. Behind them, the sun was higher in the sky now, the heat of the desert already making the air shimmer. They needed to get to a town, somewhere they could lay low and figure out their next move. Reaper didn't know where that would be, but he would find it. As they rode through the desert, the landscape stretched out endlessly before them. Reaper's mind was focused on the road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The wind whipped against his face, and the sound of the bike's engine was the only thing that broke the silence between them. The girl's grip on him tightened as they picked up speed, her face pressed against his back. Reaper could feel her warmth, her fear, but also a growing sense of trust. She was starting to believe that he would protect her, and that made all the difference. As they reached the edge of a small town, Reaper slowed the bike, his eyes scanning the area. There were a few buildings scattered along the main road, but it was quiet, too quiet. Something didn't sit right with him. He slowed further and pulled the bike into a small, run-down gas station. The bell above the door jingled as they stopped, and Reaper looked around carefully. The girl climbed off the bike, her feet unsteady, and Reaper steadied her with one hand. "Wait here," he said. "I'll be right back." He entered the gas station, his eyes moving quickly as he took in the surroundings. It was an old, worn place, with shelves full of dusty cans and bags of chips. The clerk behind the counter gave him a brief nod, but Reaper didn't trust him. The town was too quiet, and Reaper knew that silence in places like this was never a good thing. He paid for a couple of supplies and turned to leave when the sound of a car engine caught his attention. He stepped outside, his eyes narrowing as he saw the same car from last night pull into the parking lot. The men were back, and this time, they weren't going to let him slip away. Reaper's heart raced as the car from last night rolled into the gas station parking lot. The engine's growl grew louder as the vehicle came to a stop, and Reaper could feel the tension building. The men were back. He didn't need to see their faces to know they were after him and the girl. He could feel it in his bones. The girl was still inside the diner, waiting for him, unaware of the imminent danger. Reaper's mind raced as he quickly calculated his options. He couldn't risk them getting any closer. The men had already proven they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and he wasn't going to let that happen. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Without a moment's hesitation, he walked to the back of the gas station, his eyes never leaving the car. He didn't trust the clerk inside, but he didn't have time to waste. He needed a plan, and fast. The girl was depending on him. As he rounded the corner of the building, Reaper's instincts kicked into high gear. He saw the men getting out of the car, their heavy boots thudding against the pavement. They weren't making any effort to hide their movements. They were confident, too confident. Reaper knew they were used to getting what they wanted, but this time, they were going to face something they weren't expecting. He slipped into the shadows behind the building, watching as the men moved toward the diner. They were talking, but he couldn't hear their words. His eyes narrowed. They didn't look like ordinary thugs. Their clothes were too neat, too well-maintained for the kind of street-level goons Reaper was used to. These men had a different kind of edge. He could feel it. They weren't just after the girl, they were after something bigger. Reaper's mind flashed back to his time with the Hells Angels. He had seen men like this before, ruthless, calculating, and with connections that ran deep. He wasn't sure what they were after, but he knew one thing. They weren't leaving here with her. He turned and made his way to the back door of the diner. He wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. It was time to take the initiative. The door creaked as he opened it, and he slipped inside. The girl was sitting at the counter, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. She looked up as Reaper entered, relief washing over her face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The girl nodded, but Reaper could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. "I think they're here," she whispered. Reaper didn't respond. He walked over to the counter and leaned in, his voice barely audible. "We're leaving. Now." The girl's eyes widened, but she didn't question him. She knew better. Without a word, she slid off the stool and followed him to the door. Reaper kept his head down, his body tense as he stepped outside. The men were still standing by their car, talking to each other in low voices. Reaper's mind raced. He didn't have time for a confrontation. Not here, not now. They had to move, and fast. He led the girl down the alley behind the diner, his steps quick and quiet. The girl stayed close, her breath shallow with anxiety. Reaper could hear the men approaching, their footsteps growing louder as they made their way toward the back. They were getting closer. Reaper reached the bike and motioned for the girl to get on. She hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the back of the Harley, her hands gripping him tightly as he revved the engine. He kicked the bike into gear, and they sped off into the night. The road ahead was dark, the headlights of the bike cutting through the emptiness of the desert. Reaper's mind was focused on the road, but his senses were alert, scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of the men. They had to be behind them. The girl's arms tightened around him, and he could feel her trembling against his back. He didn't need to ask her what was wrong. He knew. She was scared, but Reaper wasn't going to let them catch up. Not now, not ever. He pushed the bike harder, the engine roaring as they sped down the highway. The wind whipped past them, and the desert stretched out endlessly on either side. They were alone now, but Reaper knew that wouldn't last. The men would follow. They always followed. The question was how long they could stay ahead. As they reached a fork in the road, Reaper made a quick decision and turned left, heading deeper into the desert. The road ahead was narrow, twisting between rocky outcroppings and dry brush. It was the kind of road few people knew about, and fewer still would be able to navigate in the dark. Reaper had used it many times before, but it was a dangerous route. The chances of losing the men behind them here were high, but it would take everything Reaper had to get them through safely. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. The headlights of the car were still visible in the distance, getting closer, but the terrain was changing. It was getting harder for the car to follow. Reaper pushed the bike faster, his grip tightening on the handlebars. The girl held on even tighter, her body pressed against his as they raced through the desert. The car was still behind them, but it was struggling to keep up. Reaper could see the headlights flicker as they bounced over the rough ground. They were almost there. He could feel the end of the chase coming. Reaper pushed the bike harder, the roar of the engine drowning out the sound of the wind as they sped through the rugged desert terrain. The headlights of the car were still visible in the rearview mirror, but they were fading, growing smaller as the gap between them widened. The narrow road twisted and turned, leading deeper into the wilderness, but Reaper knew it was the only way to lose them. The girl clung to him, her hands trembling as they navigated the rough path. She hadn't said much since they left the diner, but Reaper could feel the fear in her every time she tightened her grip around his waist. It wasn't just fear of the men behind them. It was the weight of everything she had been through. Reaper's mind raced. He didn't know exactly what had happened to her, but he knew it was bad. Whoever was chasing her, whatever her father had done, it wasn't something she could just forget. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but he knew he wasn't going to let her go back. Not to them, not to him. He glanced over his shoulder again. The headlights were barely visible now, the car's speed hampered by the uneven ground. They were almost free. Reaper slowed the bike slightly, taking a sharp turn around a cluster of rocks. The girl let out a small gasp, but held on tightly. They were getting closer to the hidden spot, a place he knew well, far enough off the beaten path that no one would think to look for them. The road ahead flattened out, and Reaper pushed the bike even faster. The car was no longer in sight, and he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had done it. But Reaper knew better than to relax. It was only a temporary victory. The men after them were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they found her. The road led them to a small hill, covered with dry brush and rocks. Reaper slowed the bike, carefully maneuvering around the rough terrain. They reached the top, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Reaper allowed himself to breathe. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of the cabin he had used as a hideout in the past. It was far enough from civilization that they could stay hidden, at least for a while. He pulled the bike to a stop in front of the cabin, cutting the engine. The girl climbed off, her legs shaky from the ride. Reaper steadied her, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The cabin was old, but it was sturdy. It had been built to withstand the harsh desert winds, and it was far enough off the grid that no one would think to search here. He knew it was the perfect place to lay low for a while. "Stay here," Reaper said, his voice low but firm. "I'll check it out." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. She watched as Reaper walked to the door of the cabin, his boots crunching in the sand. He pushed the door open, stepping inside. The cabin was dark, the air stale from disuse. Reaper scanned the room, checking the windows, the back door, and the corners of the room. It was clear. No one had been here in months. He stepped back outside and turned to the girl. "It's safe," he said, his voice softening for the first time. The girl stepped inside, her eyes darting around the small space. It wasn't much, just a few pieces of old furniture, a small stove, and a table. But it was a place to rest, a place to think. Reaper locked the door behind them and grabbed a few supplies from the small storage area. The girl sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're safe here," Reaper said. Again, as if saying it would make it true. She didn't respond right away. She just sat there, staring at the floor. Reaper wasn't sure what to say. He knew she was scared, but he didn't know how to comfort her. "Thank you," she whispered after a long pause. Reaper looked at her, his face hard but his eyes softening. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I'm not going to let them hurt you." The girl nodded slowly, her gaze lifting to meet his. For the first time, Reaper saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was there. "How long do we stay here?" she asked quietly. Reaper sighed, his jaw tightening. "Until I'm sure they're not looking for us," he replied. "But we can't stay here forever." The girl's eyes dropped to the floor again. Reaper could see the weight of it all on her shoulders. The fear, the uncertainty, the guilt. She had been through something terrible, and he knew that it wasn't over. But for now, they had a chance to rest, to regroup. That was all he could offer her. He stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain just slightly to scan the horizon. The desert stretched out before him, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was quiet, too quiet. Reaper knew it wouldn't last. The men would be back, and when they did, he would be ready. For now, he turned back to the girl. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll figure out what to do next in the morning." She nodded, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. Reaper walked to the door, making sure it was locked and secure. As he sat down on a nearby chair, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the cabin's worn wooden walls, casting a soft, golden light across the room. Reaper sat by the window, staring out at the vast desert stretching in every direction. It had been hours since they arrived at the cabin, but the sense of unease still lingered. The girl was asleep, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped tightly around her. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but Reaper could see the quiet terror in her eyes. Whenever she looked at him, he didn't blame her. She had been through hell. He ran a hand through his hair and stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. He had no illusions about their situation. The men chasing them weren't going to give up easily, and he couldn't afford to wait around, hoping they wouldn't find them. It was time to take action. Reaper checked the small stash of supplies he had stored in the cabin. They had enough food and water to last a couple of days, but they needed a more permanent plan. He couldn't keep her locked away here forever. The girl stirred on the couch, and Reaper glanced over at her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she didn't seem to recognize where she was. But then she remembered, and the fear returned, creeping into her eyes. Reaper walked over to her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "You're safe," he said gently, his voice low and steady. But we can't stay here long. She nodded, her hands clutching the blanket tightly around her. She didn't speak, but Reaper could feel the question hanging in the air. What now? Where do we go from here? He didn't have a perfect answer, but he knew they couldn't stay put. The longer they stayed, the greater the chances were that someone would find them. I'm going to head out, he said after a moment. Check things out. Make sure no one's following us. I'll be back soon. She didn't protest. She didn't say anything at all, but he could see the relief in her eyes at the prospect of him taking charge. Reaper grabbed his jacket, slipping his gun into the holster at his side. He stepped outside, taking a deep breath as the dry desert air filled his lungs. The silence of the morning was almost oppressive, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. As he walked around the cabin, his eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting her too. He walked up to the small ridge behind the cabin, crouching low to keep himself out of sight. From here, he had a clear view of the area around the cabin. Nothing. No sign of movement. No headlights in the distance. Reaper's heart still raced, though. Something didn't feel right. It was too quiet. He stayed there for a while, watching the land stretch out before him. But there was nothing. No one. He took a deep breath and stood up, making his way back to the cabin. He hadn't seen anyone. Maybe they had shaken the men off for good. But Reaper wasn't about to count on that. He needed to be sure. He was about to open the cabin door when he heard a sound. A low rumble in the distance. The unmistakable sound of a car engine. Reaper froze, his senses on high alert. He quickly dropped to the ground, taking cover behind a large rock. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the car grew louder, and then he saw it. The headlights, cutting through the distance. The car was coming. Reaper's grip tightened on the gun at his side. He had to think fast. They were coming for her. He couldn't let them get close. He waited until the car was almost in range, then he moved. He sprinted toward the back of the cabin, making sure to stay out of sight. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He reached the back door and pulled it open, slipping inside as quietly as he could. The girl was still on the couch, but she was wide awake now, her eyes searching for him. They're coming, Reaper said, his voice low but urgent. The girl's face went pale. What do we do? Reaper didn't hesitate. We leave. Now. He grabbed her arm gently, pulling her to her feet. The girl stumbled slightly, but Reaper steadied her, leading her toward the back door. They had to move fast. They weren't going to outrun the men this time. But they didn't need to. Reaper had a plan. He led her out the back of the cabin and into the brush, keeping to the shadows. They moved quickly, staying low, trying to stay out of sight. As they crept through the desert, Reaper kept an eye on the cabin, watching the headlights in the distance. He knew they didn't have much time. They had to get to the road, to safety, before the men caught up with them. The girl was quiet, her breath shallow as she moved beside him. Reaper could feel her fear, but he couldn't afford to show his own. They had to keep moving. They were almost at the road when he heard it, the screech of tires on the dirt. The men were close. Too close. Reaper's heart skipped a beat. They didn't have much time now. The road was just ahead, but the car was already turning onto the same path, closing the distance. He looked at the girl, her face pale in the moonlight. Run, he said. Get to the road. I'll hold them off. The girl hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she nodded and ran, her legs pumping as she sprinted toward the road. Reaper turned to face the oncoming car. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not now. Not ever. Reaper's eyes locked onto the headlights of the car as it neared. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system. He had no intention of letting them catch the girl, but the odds were stacking against him. He could see her, running as fast as she could toward the road, her figure growing smaller with each step. The men in the car weren't slowing down. They were coming for her, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Reaper shifted his position, standing tall in the path of the oncoming vehicle. He wasn't sure how much time he had, but he wasn't going to back down. The car's headlights illuminated the night, casting long shadows across the dirt. Reaper stood his ground, his hands tightening around the grip of his gun. It wasn't his preferred method of defense, but it would do the job. He heard the car's engine growl as it approached, the tires kicking up dirt behind it. The men were shouting, voices muffled by the roar of the engine, but Reaper could tell they were in no mood for negotiation. The car swerved toward him, and he could feel the heat of the headlights bearing down on him. They weren't stopping. Reaper's mind raced, calculating his options. The girl was almost to the road, but she wasn't there yet. He had to hold them off just a little longer. The car was coming fast, but he could see the panic in the driver's movements. He wasn't prepared for a confrontation. Reaper waited until the last possible moment before stepping forward, raising his gun. "Get out," he yelled, his voice low and menacing. The car slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as it skidded to a halt just inches from him. The driver's hands flew up, his face pale with fear. The other man in the passenger seat reached for something in his lap, but Reaper was faster. He had the advantage, and he wasn't going to hesitate. "Out of the car," Reaper repeated, his voice cold. The driver didn't argue. He threw open the door and stumbled out, hands in the air. Reaper's gun stayed trained on them, his eyes never leaving the men. The passenger slowly followed, his movements slow and deliberate, but Reaper could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this kind of fight. Reaper stepped closer, his feet crunching on the dry earth as he moved toward the two men. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. The driver swallowed hard, looking between Reaper and the girl, who was now standing at the edge of the road. She was safe for the moment, but he couldn't take his eyes off the two men. "We're just following orders," the driver said, his voice shaky. Reaper narrowed his eyes. "Who gave you the orders?" The man hesitated, his gaze darting to the passenger, as if looking for permission to speak. The passenger shot him a look, and the driver finally spoke. "A man named Martinez. He's been looking for her." Reaper's blood ran cold at the name. Martinez. The name echoed in his mind, and everything clicked into place. The girl's father. The man who had been hunting her. The one who had sent these men after her. Reaper's grip tightened on the gun, but he didn't move. "What do you want with her?" he asked, his voice a deadly whisper. The driver looked down, his face pale and grim. "She's got something he needs. Something he'll do anything to get." Reaper didn't speak for a moment. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of the situation. The girl wasn't just running from her father. She was running from something much bigger, something dangerous. Reaper stepped closer to the men, his voice low and controlled. "You're not taking her. Not today." The passenger sneered, his face twisted in anger. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his hand moving to the inside of his jacket. Reaper was already ahead of him. In a flash, he moved, his gun aimed at the passenger's chest. "I don't think you understand," Reaper said, his voice steady but filled with warning. The passenger froze, his hands slowly retracting. The driver was already backing away, his hands raised in surrender. "We don't want any trouble," the driver said quickly. "We were just doing our job." Reaper's eyes locked onto the two men. "Get in your car and leave. If you come anywhere near her again, I'll make sure you regret it." The men didn't hesitate. They scrambled to get back in the car, starting the engine and speeding off in a cloud of dust, leaving Reaper standing in the middle of the road. He didn't move for a moment, watching as the car disappeared into the distance. The girl had made it to the road, but Reaper knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned and walked back to her, his gun still holstered but his body tense. She looked at him, her face filled with a mix of fear and relief. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. Reaper nodded. "For now, but we need to keep moving. We can't stay here." The girl didn't argue. She simply nodded and followed him as he mounted the bike. She climbed on behind him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. Reaper started the bike, revving the engine. He could feel her body pressed against his, her breath shaky but steady. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. They had to keep moving. The road ahead was uncertain, but Reaper knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The dust settled on the empty road as Reaper gunned the engine of the Harley. The girl, still clutching him tightly, sat behind him, her breathing shallow but steady. They had managed to shake off the men, but Reaper knew that wouldn't be enough. They couldn't stay on the run forever. The road ahead seemed endless, the vast desert stretching out in every direction. The only thing in sight was the occasional cactus or rocky outcropping, the landscape a reminder that there was nowhere to hide out here. He could feel her body pressed against his, but her grip on him was tighter now. She was scared, and he didn't blame her. She had been through more than anyone should have to endure. Her father, the men chasing them, The words haunted Reaper's mind, and the weight of them weighed heavily on his chest. They were being hunted, not by ordinary men, but by someone with power, someone dangerous. Reaper pushed the bike faster, the engine roaring as they cut through the desert landscape. He glanced over his shoulder for a moment, his eyes scanning the empty road behind them. No sign of the car, but Reaper knew better. The men were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found them. How much farther? The girl asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Reaper's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. Not far, he said, but it wasn't really the truth. They were running out of options, and the more time they spent on the road, the more exposed they became. They needed to find shelter, a place to lie low. He needed to make a plan, but that was hard to do when the threat was always one step behind. The bike hummed beneath him, the rhythmic sound of the engine almost soothing, but there was no peace here. Not anymore. They were just two figures on a dark highway, running from a past that wouldn't let them go. They passed a few scattered homes in the distance, but Reaper didn't slow. He knew the kind of people who lived out here. They weren't likely to ask questions, but that didn't mean they could trust anyone. They needed to stay off the grid, far from prying eyes. The girl shifted behind him, her grip loosening for just a moment before she tightened it again. Reaper felt her trembling. He could tell she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. "We'll be safe soon," he said, trying to reassure her, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. He had no way of knowing if that was true. He couldn't afford to think that way. He had to stay focused. He had to keep her safe. But every mile they put between themselves and the men chasing them was a mile closer to the inevitable confrontation. And Reaper wasn't sure he was ready for it. As they reached the top of a hill, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a red glow over the desert. Reaper slowed the bike, his eyes scanning the surroundings. They were getting close. Up ahead, he saw a small cluster of buildings, a ghost town, likely abandoned long ago, but it might be just what they needed. A place to hide. He steered the bike toward the town, the faint outlines of the buildings becoming clearer as they approached. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the only sounds now the rumbling of the bike and the wind blowing through the empty streets. Reaper slowed as they entered the town, pulling off the road and into a narrow alleyway between two rundown buildings. He stopped the bike, the engine dying with a soft click. He didn't get off immediately. His eyes scanned the area, making sure they weren't being followed. The last thing they needed was to be trapped in a place like this. "Stay close," Reaper said, his voice low as he turned to the girl. She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. They both knew they were in enemy territory now. Reaper grabbed the bags from the back of the bike, motioning for the girl to follow him. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows as they made their way to the nearest building. It was an old, decaying structure, its windows boarded up and the door hanging off its hinges. But it was shelter, at least for the night. Reaper pushed the door open, the creak of the wood echoing in the silence. Inside, the room was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of rot. It was clear that no one had lived here for years, but it was a far cry from the desert. They could rest here, at least for a few hours. Reaper motioned for the girl to sit in the corner, keeping his back to the door as he checked the room. It was empty, save for some old furniture and debris scattered across the floor. He walked over to the window, carefully pulling back the dusty curtain to get a better view of the street outside. The town was still empty, and the road seemed deserted. For now, they were safe. "We'll stay here until we can figure out what to do next," Reaper said, turning back to the girl. She nodded, but there was no mistaking the look of fear in her eyes. She was exhausted, physically drained, but the fear was still there. Woke up just as Reaper was about to turn back to her. She blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, her gaze slowly focusing on him. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Are we safe here?" Reaper didn't answer immediately. He wanted to lie, to tell her that everything was fine, that they were safe for now. But he knew better. "For tonight, yeah. But we can't stay here forever." She nodded, as if she had already known that. The realization hit her hard, and she looked away, her eyes dark with worry. Reaper could see the exhaustion in her, the weight of everything she had been through, but he knew she was stronger than she thought. She had to be. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reaper took a deep breath. He didn't have a perfect answer, but he wasn't about to let her down. We'll keep moving. We'll find a way out of this. One way or another. The girl didn't say anything, but she met his gaze, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. Reaper knew that look. He had seen it in himself, years ago. It was the look of someone who was scared but still willing to fight. He had been fighting for a long time. And now, it wasn't just for himself anymore. He glanced at the door, his mind racing. The girl needed a plan, a way to escape all of this. And he needed to figure it out, fast. He turned back to her, his expression softening. We'll figure it out together, he said, his voice steady. I'll protect you. I won't let them get to you. The girl nodded, her hands still clenched in her lap. There was a brief silence before she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Do you think they'll stop? Reaper's gaze hardened. No, they won't stop. But neither will we. He walked over to her, kneeling down so they were eye level. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear of the unknown, but there was something else too. Hope, a small spark of it. Reaper placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll make it through this. I promise. She looked at him for a long moment before nodding. I believe you. Reaper stood up, his mind still racing. There wasn't much time. He needed to find a way to get them out of here before it was too late. He walked over to the small desk in the corner of the cabin, pulling open a drawer. Inside, he found a map of the area. He spread it out on the table, tracing his finger along the lines of roads, looking for an escape route. The men chasing them had to be closing in. They were getting closer. But there was still hope. There had to be. He marked a spot on the map, a small town a few hundred miles north. It was off the main highways, quiet and isolated. It might be their best shot at getting away. We leave in the morning, Reaper said, turning back to the girl. She had fallen silent, her eyes watching him as he examined the map. Are you ready? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. I'm ready, she said quietly. Reaper nodded, folding the map carefully and placing it in his jacket. He walked over to the door and checked the locks, making sure everything was secure. As he turned back to the girl, he knew that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to make sure they both got through it. The past was still chasing them, but Reaper knew he would do whatever it took to protect her. In this thrilling chapter of Hell Angel's stories, Reaper is tasked with protecting a young girl from a dangerous past as he faces overwhelming odds. The girl is being hunted, and her journey of survival leads her to the safety of Reaper's protection. As Reaper navigates through desolate lands, the pursuit of those who seek the girl intensifies. With every turn, the stakes rise in these Hell Angel stories, revealing a story of loyalty, survival, and the pursuit of justice. Reaper is a seasoned biker, hardened by his experiences, but this mission is different. He must protect this girl from a threat far greater than he anticipated. The Hell Angel stories unfold as Reaper takes on a new role, not just as a lone warrior, but as a protector, facing down powerful forces to keep the girl safe. The journey is filled with danger, betrayal, and the weight of a past that refuses to stay buried. As the tension builds, Reaper must find a way to outrun their enemies and ensure that the girl can have a future free from the shadows of her past. This is more than just another story in the Hell Angel story series. It's a fight for survival against all odds.